Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
Which say that most people tend to give themselves a high rating. So, for example, if you have a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being very good character and 1 being very bad character, most people tend to give themselves about a 4 out of 5. I think then if the empirical story is to be believed about how people tend to actually behave, then we inflate our self-rating.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 78, where we celebrate the year artificial insulin was invented and the Space Invaders arcade game was released. What a year. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Christian B. Miller about his book, The Character Gap: How Good Are We? Christian B. Miller is the A.C. Reed Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University. He is the past director of the Character Project, funded by $5.6 million in grants from the John Templeton Foundation and Templeton World Charity Foundation. Professor Miller is the author of over 90 articles as well as 4 books, including The Character Gap: How Good Are We?, which was his first trade book for a general audience. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. Very excited to join you. We are in July somehow already here in 2020, and I am very excited to talk to author Christian Miller today about his book, The Character Gap: How Good Are We? Christian, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be on your show.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. Really interested in the book. I think this is something that probably all of us are thinking through at some level all the time. I certainly am. And just trying to better understand our fellow humans. So this is a book that really tries to tackle that. So just to kick things off, just talk to us about, in your mind, what is The Character Gap as a book all about?
Sure. So first of all, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and share some of these ideas. The character gap, I think of it, the title Character Gap is the gap between how we actually are and the kind of person we should be. So on the one hand, there's the kind of virtuous character, which we'll get into, I'm sure, as we go along. And on the other hand, there's the kind of character we actually have. Mm-hmm. And are the two the same thing, or do they come apart? And over the course of the book, I explore what it means to have a character in the first place, why it's important to develop a virtuous or good character, what our character actually looks like, and how, in fact, our character does fall short of a virtuous character. And then finally, towards the end of the book, I say, well, we're not left to nothing. It's not a hopeless situation. We can actually take steps, practical steps, to try and improve our character, become better people, so that the character gap can shrink in our own lives, so that our actual character can better mirror or represent the virtuous character we should all have. So that's how I would boil it down.
Yeah, and which, I think sounds great and hopefully would sound great to a great many people. So just to take a quick step back before we dive into all of that, maybe just talk a little bit about the genesis of the book. I mean, how did you decide that this was a topic you wanted to pursue and now was the right time to kind of collect it all into a book?
Sure. So I'm a professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University, where I've been for the last 15 years. And like most philosophy professors, I've been doing the kind of academic thing of writing books and articles for other academics that no one reads, and that we just kind of work our way through our technical vocabulary and more abstract argumentation. And in particular, I've been working on this topic of character for many, many years now. And I just got to the point where I said to myself, look, this is such an important, practical, applicable, real world topic. It would be a shame if it just kind of stayed at the level of academic writing and discourse. Mm-hmm. I thought that we were doing some interesting and innovative work here at Wake Forest on character. And I wanted to try and take that work and make it accessible to a larger audience. And so about 5 years ago, that thought occurred to me. And I said, well, one way to do this is to try to write a more popular book, a trade book that has a lot of the ideas in it from the academic work, but without the jargon, without the degrees that you normally have to have in the academic world to understand what's going on. At the same time, I didn't have any training in doing this kind of thing. As academics, we're not encouraged or incentivized to write for a proper audience. So it was a bit of a gamble and a risk. But I just said, well, let's see what happens. Let me give it a try. And over the course of the ensuing 2 years, whenever I had some free moments, I would write a chapter here, write a chapter there. And the long story short is that the character gap emerged. I'm really, really thrilled that I had the opportunity to do it, and that I actually did it.
Right.
That the ideas are out there now, and that some people are reading them, and hopefully everyone who reads them will benefit from them.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of a great story. And for you, as you were going through this process of writing as you could and putting these ideas together that you've been working on for so long, was there anything that struck you as particularly difficult when trying to kind of pull everything together and write it for an audience that maybe hadn't been as steeped in the information in the environment that you had been in?
Yeah, so there are several things. One of which is just making sure I don't fall into the same bad habits that would be bad for a general audience, but habits that are normal for me as an academic. Mm-hmm. So one habit is to use language that most people don't use, right? We have our own kind of vocabulary, our own technical terminology, and it's so easy for me, having done it for so long, to just fall into those ways of writing. And I have to kind of check myself and come back and say, no. Look, no one outside of a handful of philosophers are going to know what a priori means, or traits, or dispositions, or counterfactuals, or these other words that are so part of my vocabulary. And so make sure all that language was stripped out of the manuscript. And then also at the same time, we tend as philosophers not to use many real world examples and real world case studies. We tend to engage in more hypothetical, abstract discourse. And so making sure, doing something that was also unfamiliar to me, bringing in news stories, bringing in biographies of real people and delving into the details of their lives. Engaging with some current events, that kind of thing. So really pushed me outside of my comfort zone in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think the book does do that effectively, and really helps you, or it helped me anyway, avoid that sort of common philosophical vagueness that I think can draw people away from that. So yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
So let's kind of start at the beginning here. In your mind, as you started working through this book and based on everything you've done and your research and your thoughts, so how can we think about what character actually is for us as humans, and breaking out those traits that we think are important for a character?
Sure. So I focus mainly on moral character. Character comes in different varieties and types, and I said to myself, look, I don't want to bite off too much. Let's just focus on moral character. Let's leave aside other character traits that have to do maybe with sports or with art or with religion or other things. Put them to one side. And so I focused just on moral character. I'm thinking of it as follows. I'm thinking that this is our kind of moral fiber. This is how we are psychologically put together so that it leads us to think, feel, and act a certain way. So I think a moral character has three components: our thinking about morality, our feelings and motivations about morality, and then our external or outward behavior that's morally relevant. So to take that down a notch of abstraction, let's pick an actual character trait. Let's say take something like honesty. So honesty is a character trait that some people have, some people don't. If you have it as part of your psychology, part of your mind, it leads you to think a certain way, think thoughts like the truth is important, it's wrong to cheat, it's wrong to steal. It leads you to have certain feelings, emotions, and motivations, like being motivated to tell the truth, being motivated not to cheat or steal from the store. And those psychological elements, those thoughts and feelings, can give rise to honest behavior. So lo and behold, the honest person doesn't cheat on the test or doesn't steal from the store and instead tells the truth and does the honest thing. So that's an illustration of what I think the three components of moral character are: the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions. Now, to take it one step further, I would break moral character up into two families: the moral virtues and the moral vices. So the good side of moral character and the bad side of moral character. You can put it that way.
Yeah.
And these categories might sound like they're more academic or less or not as familiar, but if we actually have examples of each of a virtue and a vice, I think we'll say, oh yeah, I know what we're talking about. I see that these are important. So moral virtues are things like honesty, which I've already mentioned, but also things like courage, justice, self-control, being respectful of others. On the flip side, with vices, well, you can just say, okay, the virtues, well, corresponding to each virtue, there's an opposing vice. That's the bad side of moral character. So for courage, there's cowardice. For justice, there's injustice. For honesty, there's dishonesty. And so, of course, I think that it's important to cultivate the moral virtues, to try to develop them, and stay away from the moral vices. The moral virtues are those character traits which dispose you to think, feel, and act well. And the moral vices are those which dispose you to think, feel, and act badly or poorly.
Yeah. And then, once you get into that definition, you start talking about, our characters and how a lot of times we can think of ourselves as virtuous in some ways or have vice in others, or put that label on other people that, oh, they're virtuous or they're vice, or they tell the truth or they lie or they cheat or they fight against injustice, whatever. But one of the big things you raise as something that we don't pay attention to as much, but should maybe, and we haven't talked about yet, is kind of the reason or motivation behind actions. And so, thinking about someone being honest or thinking about someone cheating on a test or something like that, for you, or at least in the way that you describe this, in order to truly bring ourselves up to a more virtuous level, or to truly label someone as being, full of vice, their reason or motivation also needs to kind of figure into that equation. So why do you think that's the case, and how can we start to use that information, or how do we make sense of virtues and vices with that in mind?
Yeah, great question. So there are several components to that, and I'll try and break them down. First, why do I think motivation is important? I think that because of certain examples. So if you think of certain cases where the motivation is off or askew, then I think you don't have virtue. So let me give you a case. This is not original to me. I'll credit it to a philosopher named Michael Stocker. So suppose you're in a hospital. You've been there for a couple of weeks. You're lonely. No one's come to visit you. Then one day there's a knock on the door. The door opens, and here's your best friend. And your best friend comes in and greets you and says, "How you doing?" And you say, "Oh, I'm doing much better. Thanks so much for coming to see me. I'm so glad to see you. Why'd you come to see me today?" And in a moment of brutal honesty, your best friend says, "Well, I was bored and I had nothing better to do." Or, "Well, I knew that I would feel guilty if I didn't come see you." Or, "Well, our other friends put us up to us and paid me some money to come see you." Now, normally your friends wouldn't say that, of course, but
Yeah.
but in this example, the person's being brutally honest and revealing the underlying motivation for why they're doing an action which is good, coming to see you in the hospital. So if you just stuck with the action, you would say that was a compassionate action. That's evidence that my friend is compassionate, a compassionate person. But then when you dig deeper and look at the underlying motivation, you say, oh, wait a second. That's not the appropriate motivation for a compassionate person. A compassionate person would have answered like this, because I care about you, or because you're my friends, or because I was concerned about whether you were getting better or not. Here, the motivation is other directed. It's focused on how you're doing and not on how the friend can benefit in some way. So it's what philosophers call altruistic or selfless motivation, as opposed to egoistic or self-centered motivation. Now, I'm persuaded by examples like that. That in cases like that, even if the external behavior is fine, if the underlying motivation isn't appropriate as well, isn't virtuous as well, the person doesn't qualify as virtuous. And then you can generalize from that example to lots of other examples. So politicians are easy cases here. Externally, politicians might have a lot of, do a lot of things to please the crowd.
Right.
But what's their underlying motivation really like? So if we grant that assumption then that I make, that motivation is important, then a second thing you were asking about is, well, how do we make use of that? And I think here we would want to say, well, what motivation is okay and what motivation is not okay? I think we want to dig deeper and say, can we kind of organize or classify into virtuous motivation and not virtuous motivation? And then once we have that, we can do a third thing, which is to say, how am I doing? What's my heart like?
Yeah.
What do my motives tend to be like? Are they tend to be virtuous or not? And here, when it comes to classifying or thinking through those motivations, it gets a little tricky, but I think it helps to introduce a little bit of terminology, and which I've already hinted at, which is that terminology: egoistic or self-centered, altruistic or selfless, and in a third category, dutiful or impartial. So let me go through each one and explain a little bit more, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And then hopefully that'll make more sense. So egoistic or self-interested, that's probably the most familiar to us because it's probably the most common also. But for the label, it probably makes sense already. So things like, I'm doing it so I can get pleasure, or I'm doing something so I can get rewards in the afterlife, or I'm doing something so I don't feel guilty later on for not doing it. It's all about me. I'm doing the action with the goal in mind of ultimately benefiting myself. I say that those motivations are always not virtuous. So if I'm motivated to benefit myself, that's not going to be virtuous motivation. Okay, so then we go to the second category, altruistic, selfless. So there I'm doing things like helping someone else for his or her own sake. My ultimate goal is to benefit that other person for his or her own sake, regardless of whether I benefit in the process or not. I may benefit, I may not. It can come along as a byproduct or a side effect. If I benefit, that's great, but that's not my goal. My goal, my heart, is directed outward as opposed to inward. I say in this case, that's virtuous. That shouldn't be too surprising, right?
Yeah.
So a compassionate person has that altruistic motivation to care about others. The third category is probably the least familiar, and that's the dutiful one. That's things like if you said, why are you visiting me today? And the person said, because I think it's the right thing to do. Or it's because God commanded me to do it. Or it's because I have a moral obligation to do it. Here it's not about me, it's not about you, it's about something impersonal and impartial. What the right thing is.
Yeah.
So I'm not doing it to benefit myself. I'm not doing it to benefit the other person. I'm doing it simply because it's the right thing.
Yeah, so I guess
And
I want to understand, like, so where's that last one come from then? I mean, so there's an obvious example of God, right? If it's if it's from religion, then that's where it comes from. But for other places, if someone just says, well, it's the morally right thing to do, is that, can we fit that into some of the first two somehow? You know, like if someone says it's morally correct, well, are they actually saying, I'm then trying to follow that? I'm kind of altruistic because I'm following my own moral code. You know, like where's the moral morality coming from in that case, if not from either a desire to serve yourself or serve others?
Yeah, that's good. Good, and it may collapse ultimately into one of those two. So
Yeah.
that's an open
Fair.
question. I think it doesn't automatically have to, though.
Okay.
But it's a case by case matter for each individual. So certainly someone could say, I'm doing it because it's the right thing. And then you ask them a follow up question and say, well, why do you think it's important to do the right thing? And they say, well, because I can get rewards in the afterlife.
Then you're back to that. Yeah.
Back to egoistic. But what if instead someone said, I'm doing it because it's the right thing, and you say, well, why do you think it's important to do the right thing? And I say, well, just because I care about doing the right thing.
Right.
Or it's good to do the right thing.
Yeah, it's a closed loop. Right.
Yeah, it's closed. That's right. So it ends there. There's no further story to tell. I think that's possible.
Sure.
So this is the picture that emerges from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant thought that in fact was the best kind of motivation. That ultimately we should be doing all of our moral actions out of what he would call respect for the moral law, which is very fancy terminology, but just a desire to do the right thing. Why? Because it's the right thing.
Yeah. And that to me is the one that could, I guess they could all, I mean, there's all tons of variation there, but that one, because it's the right thing, because it's the right thing to whom, and then that gets into questions about variance across time and culture and society and all of that. So, you could have people doing an action for good reason. It could be one action, but it could be for good reasons or for bad reasons. It could be taking something they want to achieve and doing different actions to get there, depending on different codes in different places. So I think that part also, it seems tricky. So do you feel like that you approach that from a particular lens in this book?
I do, but I didn't say enough about it. So this issue is one that people have wished that I had said a lot more about. But I kept it kind of under the radar because it's a really big topic. So this is taking us into the territory of the foundations of morality.
Can of worms. Okay.
And a big can. So I'll say my view. I mean, I'll tell you my view. Yeah. But this could easily take us another hour to really explore.
I apologize for the big diversion. We'll try and make it short, and then we can go back to some of the other stuff in the book.
Yeah. So there are two broad perspectives here. One perspective is to say that morality is created by human beings, whether that's individual human beings, that would be kind of individual moral relativism, or whether it's cultures and societies, that would be more cultural moral relativism. Morality is a human construction, and therefore it can vary from culture to culture or individual to individual without there being one right answer. So you have your morality, my morality, Hitler has his morality, and none of us is any more or less correct at the end of the day in our moral codes. The opposite perspective is moral objectivism or moral realism, which says naturally enough that there is a objective morality or one correct moral code that governs all human beings. Whether that moral code was created by a divine being, that's a popular view, that God or the gods put in place a moral code for human beings, or whether that objective morality just exists on its own without a creator, on the analogy with scientific laws. It could be F equals MA. There can also be murder is wrong. So whether that, that's a further debate of where that objective morality comes from. My view is one in line with most philosophers, interestingly enough, that the objective morality position is correct. So I think like most philosophers, but maybe not like most high school students or undergraduates. I think that there is an objective morality, and so there is a right and wrong answer to a lot of these questions about ethics, including the ones we've just been talking about with respect to morality. So I think if someone is motivated this way, is that objectively virtuous? There's an answer. If they're motivated this other way, is that objectively virtuous? There's an answer. And so when I say, altruistic motivation or selfless motivation is virtuous, I don't mean to just be voicing my opinion, although it is my opinion. I also hope to be capturing what is the truth.
Okay.
But of course, that's highly contested matter.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying. So, one thing I think that, like we talked about a little bit earlier, that I appreciated about the book, and you said you specifically set out to do, was to bring in these real world examples. And you have a lot of psychology studies that have been done to try and examine behavior and how we go about making decisions under various circumstances. And just wanted to check in and see if you had any particular favorite studies that you feel like really illustrated something surprising or different, or something that really helped clarify a point you made in the book.
Sure. So as the book goes along, what we started talking about was the kind of definition of character. What is character? What is good character? What is bad character? Then as the book goes along, I talk about why is character important. But then I spent a lot of time on this question of, well, how good is our character? Mm-hmm. We have the kind of basics in place. How are we doing? Are we already virtuous? Well, that's great if we are. Then we don't need to worry about it anymore. But it's hard to answer that from the armchair. As a philosopher, I spent a lot of time in the armchair thinking deep questions and trying to get answers. But that question, how good are we? I need something else to answer besides just the armchair.
Yeah.
So I looked around and I said, well, one place to go to answer it is psychological research. Because for the last 50 plus years, there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies which have put lots of participants into different situations and see how they react, including morally relevant situations where participants have an opportunity to harm or not harm, help or not help, cheat or not cheat, lie or not lie, steal or not steal. So let's look at these more controlled, carefully orchestrated studies and see not what any one study tells us, but what cumulatively the emerging picture becomes from those studies, or seems to be from those studies. So that's what I've been doing for many years of my research, is reading hundreds of these studies and drawing implications from them. Mm-hmm. To give you just a couple of examples real quickly, one study I like to talk a lot about is the group effect research from the 1960s. So this is research inspired by real world examples where an emergency was going on and people observed it but did nothing to help. And psychologists have been able to recreate that kind of setup and then try to explain why that is, and people tended not to help in groups. So a really famous example of this kind of study was from 1968, where if you're a participant, you come into the lab, you're taken into a room, you're given a survey to complete, you're told to sit down at the table, given a pen or pencil and the survey, and then left alone. A few minutes later, a stranger comes in, is told to sit at the same table and complete the same survey. So now the two of you are working on the survey. A few minutes later, in the next room, you would have heard what sounds like a big crash, and the person in charge screaming in pain, saying, my leg, ouch, 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 get this thing off me, or similar things like that, where it clearly sounds like an emergency is going on, there's been some kind of crash, and she's in trouble. So the question is, well, what would you do if you were in that situation? Mm-hmm. And overwhelmingly, people say, well, of course I would do something. I would jump out of my seat, go into the next room, and see if I could help this woman. Well, the answer is that it really depends. If the stranger that you're with does nothing, and keeps working on the survey, it's very likely that you will do nothing yourself and not help. In fact, in that particular study, only 7% of participants helped when the stranger they were with did nothing. So 93% did nothing to help, 7% helped. As opposed to another variation where the participants were by themselves initially. There was no stranger. And in that variation, 70% helped when the emergency happened in the next room. So to me, this is surprising, as it is to most people who hear about the study, that the lack of helping from a complete stranger could hinder me so much from helping myself when an emergency is going on. And this, it turns out to be replicated many times. There are lots of different variations of it. And it also bears out in the real world. So in the news, every year there are these cases of so-and-so gets hit by a car or has a heart attack in a store, and no one does anything to help. They just act like nothing's happening, and the person ends up dying. This is one piece of evidence for a more pessimistic story about our character. That in this kind of case, if people were really compassionate, they shouldn't behave this way. They should rise to the challenge, step up to the plate, and help, even if a stranger isn't doing anything. Okay, so that's one study. Now, by itself, it doesn't prove anything. Right. So I always want to stress, this is one study. It's just a piece of evidence for a more pessimistic story about compassion. I'll give you just one more. I fear I've gone on too long.
It's okay.
I'll counterbalance that with a more positive story.
Yeah.
So in another body of research, psychologists have explored the impact of empathy on helping. And there they've been able to show that if you feel empathy for the suffering of another person, you're much more likely to help that person. So in one study, college students were told that a fellow student at their university had a terrible tragedy and needed help with things like grocery shopping and babysitting and so forth. Would those students be willing to volunteer some of their own time to help the student who they didn't know at all at their university? And in one scenario, they were given a very kind of matter-of-fact presentation of the details. And another version of the story, they were given a much more empathetic rendering of the details, where they were encouraged to try and imagine what this other person was going through, try to see things from her perspective. And in the empathetic group, many, many, many more participants signed up to help and donated multiple hours of their time to help this stranger at the university.
Yeah,
that's commendable. That's right. That's a plus. That's a check mark.
Yeah,
on the side of good character.
Yeah, and I think that sort of speaks. As I went through the book, I think I could see you sort of building up to this argument there, which is that we think of ourselves in a very solid way, I guess, in terms of what we think our moral code is, and what is right and what was wrong, and how we would act. But in fact, it's actually incredibly fluid, depending on not just the situation, but the particular circumstances of that situation. That will actually lead us to behave differently, even giving the same prompt to start off with. So, this is, I would say, surprising and quite counterintuitive. I think it would be for a lot of people. So, knowing that, I guess, do you have any sense of, after looking at all this, that you have a sense of why that might be, and what we would then want to understand about ourselves differently from that? Right. Because we'll talk about it in a sec, but you start to talk about ways to solve this and how we can bridge the gap. But just, maybe just to pause and go, while we're thinking about that, what is it that we want to take away from realizing that we're not who we were?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So there are lots of things to say here. First of all, you're right that we tend to think of ourselves as having a positive character. My job in this part of the book was to try to assess people's character using empirical data.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a separate question. Well, how do we assess our own character? Just normally, how do we think of ourselves? And there are studies there too, which say that most people tend to give themselves a high rating. So, for example, if you have a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being very good character and 1 being very bad character, most people tend to give themselves about a 4 out of 5. I think then if the empirical story is to be believed about how people tend to actually behave, then we inflate our self-rating. We don't deserve that high of a rating. My picture is one of what I call mixed character, where we have some good sides to our character and some bad sides to our character, but not enough good sides to merit virtue, counting as virtuous, but at the same time, not enough bad sides to merit vice, to count ourselves as vicious people. And I want to stress that this is, I think, what is true of most people. I think there's a bell curve here.
Yeah.
I think that there are outliers on both extremes. There are some, examples of moral exemplars and heroes on one side. There are some examples of moral villains and horrendous people on the other. But I'm trying to think of what most of us are like. I think most of us are in this murky middle. Now, second part to what you were saying, why would this be? Why would we have a higher rating of ourselves than maybe we deserve? And also, why would we tend to seem to change and vary our behavior so much with the details of the situation we're in? I don't know if I have a really good answer to those questions.
Yeah.
Those are really, really challenging questions.
No, it's okay.
I mean, I think there's something to be said for if you think of yourself more positively, that might make your life go better. Just like,
sure.
The old slogan about drivers, 90% of people think that they're above average drivers. Right. You probably don't want everyone to have a realistic picture of how good or bad of a driver they are, because it might make them a worse driver, as a matter of fact, if they knew how bad they really were.
Sort of like an expectation becomes reality.
Yeah, so that could be, this is just speculation though. I don't really have a worked out story. What I can say a little bit more about the variation from circumstance to circumstance. So what this shows, I think, is that our minds aren't completely transparent to ourselves.
Yes.
So we have our conscious mind, and we have kind of the thoughts that we're aware of and that we go through our day-to-day lives deliberating about. But there's more to the mind than just that. There's also the unconscious part of our mind. This is not me getting kind of weirdly Freudian or anything like that. This is pretty much uncontroversial stuff these days. And it's in an unconscious part of our mind that there are also moral impulses that can influence how we behave. I'm going to give you one more example. In a really interesting study, when people were in a shopping mall and passed clothing stores, and then were given an opportunity to do a small helping task, very few of them did. When in the same shopping mall, different shoppers had just passed Mrs. Fields cookies or Cinnabons, and then were given the chance to do the same helping task, the majority of them did. What was the difference? The smell from the Mrs. Fields cookies and Cinnabons, which put those shoppers in a better mood, which then unconsciously led them to want to maintain their good mood, and helping was an opportunity for them to maintain their good mood.
Yeah.
Now, why do I bring that up? That's an illustration of how if you were a shopper in that shopping mall and you helped that person after having passed Mrs. Fields cookies or Cinnabons, you might have no idea about the impact that smell had on you.
Yeah.
And yet, in fact, it did influence you in a certain way, kind of nudged you a certain way towards helping more than you would have otherwise. And that's due to the impact of part of our minds, which are not immediately transparent to us.
Yeah. And so I think that's a good transition we can make into kind of some of your solutions to bridging this gap. So now that we've kind of identified that, there's when you think about the virtuous person that we want to be, and some of us think that we are, and perhaps there's a little bit more to be done there, and we want to think about ourselves as a society, how we can try and bridge this gap. I'd love to hear some of those ideas. And, in the book, you interestingly start off with ones that are less promising and kind of work your way up. And so just curious to know how you kind of ranked them and how you thought through that.
Yeah, good. So I go through a number of strategies, and let me maybe hit the ones I like the best.
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
start with those. And then if there's time, you can tell me if you want to get into some of the ones I think are less promising. I think the first thing to say, though, is that there's good news here.
Right.
If we had said, okay, our character is mediocre or middle of the road, and oh, by the way, there's nothing you can do about it. Your character is kind of stuck in the mud. You can't change it. Sorry, see you later. Then that would be discouraging.
Hard to sell.
Well, I guess hard to make many friends.
Right.
But I think I didn't want to leave. I could have ended it there. I just said, look, this is the way it is, and deal with it. And it's true of me. I'm not saying that I'm any better. It's true of me too. But the evidence here, again from psychology, is that a character is malleable, and that can change over time. That's encouraging. It's not, though. There are no quick fixes. There are no magical pills to take. There's no overnight solutions. We already know this. But it's worth emphasizing that character change is a very slow, gradual process, and it's not linear usually. So even if you're making some progress, it's usually because it's usually intermixed with many setbacks. And so you're going to see a jagged progression towards, hopefully, virtue and not towards vice. Having said that, there are some kind of concrete steps you can take and different strategies you can employ that I think will help move the needle along. Mm-hmm. Though I talk about three in particular that I highlight as I think most promising. Piggybacking on what we were just talking about, one is what I call getting the word out. And by that I mean increased self-awareness. So if we accept that there are parts of our mind that we may not have complete access to, and that could be holding us back from being virtuous people, well, it would be good to know about that, become more aware of that, and then try to counteract them, be on guard and counteract them if the situation arises. So to make that more concrete and to tie back to some of our earlier discussion, in the group effect research, what they're doing is showing us that a surprising thing about our psychology, that we are held back in groups from helping others sometimes. Why? Well, because one thing that's going on is our fear of embarrassment. We're afraid of embarrassing ourselves in front of strangers and making ourselves look like a fool. And so we're more inclined to stand back in the crowd and diffuse responsibility over everyone rather than rushing out ourselves and having it be a hoax or the person doesn't really need help after all.
Yeah.
Well, how does that relate to improvement? Learning about this, getting the word out, increased self-awareness about how susceptible I am to fear of embarrassment can be really important, because when I'm in other situations in a group and I see something wrong and I'm initially inclined to hold back, I can be reminded of what's going on. I can try and counteract that, whether it's in a board meeting and someone's saying something egregious and I wanted to kind of do the easy thing of just being silent, or whether it's on the street and someone drops papers or has a health emergency, and I initially incline not to do anything, but I step up to the plate. Okay, so that's one strategy, getting the word out. The two others we haven't really touched on yet, so let me turn to those. One is the role of moral exemplars, moral heroes, and moral saints. So I think it's can be really helpful to have people in our lives who embody virtue. And then we can look to them as examples, not just of what to do, but of what kind of person to be. So we can admire their lives and have their lives be a source of inspiration for me to change my life so that it becomes more like their life. to make that less abstract, these could be famous exemplars. It could be Jesus. It could be Gandhi. It could be Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, so forth. Well-known ones. Those sometimes can be distant or not as relatable.
Mm-hmm.
They're still important. I don't want to downplay them at all. They're still very important.
Yeah.
But I also want to emphasize that exemplars can be very near and dear to us in our ordinary day-to-day lives. They could be our neighbor. They could be a family member or a friend. They could be a work colleague. They don't have to be perfect. No one is, right? We're not saying exemplary in every respect. It's just in one or two respects, maybe their honesty or maybe their courage. They stand above the crowd, and it can be a source of inspiration for me to try and change my life so that it better mirrors their life. So then the strategy is, to seek out those people. If there are no such people in one's life, or at least in the areas where you struggle the most, where I struggle the most, seek out those people. Try and find them, either real world people or people from the past who you can read about and learn more about their lives.
Makes sense.
And then the third one, last one I'll end with, is what I call moral reminders. Strategy of using moral reminders. So let me introduce this one by using yet another study, unless your patience with the study is run out. So this is one that's near and dear to my heart because I'm an academic, and the study has to do with cheating. So in this study, students had the opportunity to take a test with 20 problems. They would, in the control condition, which means the baseline, the one we're going to start with, they had no opportunity to cheat. They just took the test, and they would be paid 50 cents per correct answer. So it's cut and dry. In one version of the study, the participants got about 7 problems correct out of 20. In another group of participants, they were also given the test, 20 problems, 50 cents per correct answer, but they were the ones who graded the test themselves, destroyed all the materials, and just verbally reported how many answers they got correct in quotation marks. Mm-hmm. Well, depending on what your level of optimism is about human beings, you might expect, cheating or not. But given our discussion, you should expect, I think, cheating, and that's what happened.
Right.
14 correct in quotation marks, 14 out of 20 in this group versus 7 out of 20 in the baseline. So not so good character. Now, what does this have to do with improving our character? There was a third group. And in this group, they first had to sign their university's honor code. So at Wake Forest University, where I teach, we have an honor code, and you're supposed to pledge your honor that you will not lie or cheat in the course of the ensuing exam. So these participants had to sign their university's honor code. Then they took the test, 50 cents per correct answer. They graded it themselves. They had the same opportunity to cheat as the second group did. They could have done it, but in this group, cheating disappeared. There was no cheating found. So what is that? What's the lesson of that? Well, that to me says lots of lessons. It's a fascinating study. But one thing it says is that more reminders can be really important influences in our lives to keep our perspective where it needs to be. The honor code was functioning as a moral reminder to remind the students of their own values, of the importance of honesty and of integrity and of not cheating and so forth. And when they had that moral reminder, it was very hard for them to suddenly turn around and cheat on the test. And so, of course, I'm not saying we should all have honor codes that we sign every day when we get up in the morning, but there are analogs of that, right? Yes. Having more reminders, whether that's our reading that you start your day with to get your perspective oriented, or a diary that you complete at the end of the day when you look back over the day and you think back, what could I have done better? Or programming your phone to receive certain text messages once or twice a day, depending on what the topic is of moral character. Could be like, empathy text messages, or justice text messages, or honesty text messages. Or having other things in your life, signs on the wall, slogans that you think are bookmarks, slogans that you think are important, that just do this job of reminding us of what's really important morally.
Sure.
That's the third strategy. So it's getting the word out, self-awareness, moral exemplars, and then moral reminders are the three ones that I really like to highlight.
Yeah, and I think those are all great ones because they're ones we can do. Like I can tomorrow start figuring out ways to implement those ideas and bring them into my life. So I think that's another aspect I really appreciated about the book is, not only are there solutions, but there are solutions that you can do with, some minimal time and effort to get things going.
Yeah, thank you. And I would really want to throw in just a bit of caution.
Yeah. Sure.
Solutions in the abstract.
Right.
And then there's solutions in the real world. There's no, 10 points checklist to go through or no recipe that if I just followed it to the letter, I'm guaranteed to have a virtuous character. Life is messy. We make mistakes. There are going to be setbacks. There are going to be hard circumstances. So there's nothing, guaranteed here. But it's certainly, I think, worth the effort. And as much progress as we can make, we should try to do that.
Here. I think that is a great way to end that. And just before we wrap the whole thing up, is there anything else you wanted to cover that we didn't have a chance to? Any other big ideas you think people should understand or take away?
I think we've covered a lot of ground really well. I would say just stressing that this matters.
Yeah.
That this is not just an academic discussion we're having. This is not one thing amongst many that we could fill our day with. I think this really needs to be something that we prioritize in our lives, and we do prioritize. Parents think that character is really important when they're raising their children. Employers think that character is really important when they're trying to hire the best employees. Mm-hmm. It matters in all kinds of ways. It matters in my own life. A good character will make my life go better. There's evidence that it has benefits for me, all kinds of benefits. It improves my life.
Sure.
It's not guaranteed, but on average, it does. It makes society go better. The more justice and compassion there is in society will go better. Depending on if you're religious or not, from all the major world religions emphasize the importance of character and say that it's something we really need to be paying attention to. So for a multitude of reasons, I think this is a really important topic to devote some serious time to and make a priority in our lives.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I think not only can people listen to this, but they can also read the book where there is a far more thorough discussion, still at that accessible level, but far more thorough discussion of strategies, ideas. Some of these studies we really get into. I think, the book does a lot more here for people that are interested. But all right, let's just wrap it up. We'll do a quick thunder round, and we'll call it a day. All right?
Sounds good.
Okay. So, what is your favorite food and or drink?
Favorite food would be my mother's birthday cake, which is yellow cake with chocolate icing.
Oh, sounds good.
I just had it for so many years. It's hardwired into me.
Fair. Fair. Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
That's hard to choose from. One favorite would have to be Athens, Greece, which makes sense. It's just a beautiful place. It's just wonderful to walk around, but it also has that connection to me as a philosopher.
Sure.
That's the kind of where Western philosophy had its birthplace. I could walk, the same places that Socrates walked when he was talking to, the Athenians about ideas of justice and of courage and of character. So on a really personal level and on an aesthetic level, Athens will always remain in my mind.
Yeah, I've been there as well. It was definitely beautiful. All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
In the whole world?
It's your wand.
Well, I guess the tricky answer would be I would change things so that I would have many more wand wavings.
Right. Extra wishes.
So,
yes, this is always the right way to respond to these questions.
Wave the wand, so I got a lot more wand wavings.
Yeah.
If I was thinking, and then of course the big answer is like world peace and no more starvation and no more suffering. And so of course it's hard to argue with those things. That that everyone would be happy. So that all makes, as a philosopher, how can I go against that? But if I could wave the wand and make one big change, I guess it would only make sense, given our discussion, that people would be much more virtuous than they are now, myself included, starting with myself.
Right.
And we would all be much more close. We would approximate the ideal of perfect virtue much more than we do now.
All right. Fair enough. I appreciate the wide-ranging thought to give a response to that question. All right. Well, the book again, Character Gap, How Good Are We? Christian Miller, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.